Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Atomic Mass Transmissions Live. That's right, I'm back, and I'm here, and we're going to paint a Sunspot from Marvel Crisis Protocol. It's very exciting. I haven't been on a stream since Mini-Strav, and those weren't painting streams, so it's been a while since I gotten to hang out and paint some cool stuff with y'all. We're going to do that today, so let's just dive right in and get it going. All the mutant fun. That's right. That's right. So here we have our Sunspot. I'm going to do something a little different today. You can obviously see this man is very, very pink. And that's because I thought, let's not do the X-Force costume. Let's go ahead and do the classic yellow and black costume, because I think you can absolutely do that on this miniature with a couple of little like creative flourishes. So obviously we've got the collar from the X-Force suit that we'll have to deal with, but that should be pretty easy. We'll just do that yellow. And then the design isn't exact, but it's going to look close enough that I think no one's going to notice, right? Everyone's just going to kind of buy into it. And the reason that I went with pink as my undercoat is because pink is a great natural shade for yellow, so this conceivably will make doing our yellows and stuff that much easier, although it will come down to the consistency on our yellow. But that's overall kind of the goal, was to do something a little different here. And by so doing, we're going to go ahead and just do a different take on yellow. Now, a lot of the times when you see this technique, people use an airbrush. Airbrushing always makes yellow easier because you can get those nice, smooth, thin coats much quicker, much easier than necessarily using a brush. But with a couple of additional coats, a little bit of patience, and some perseverance, we'll be able to get to the same results on this man here. So I'm going to add a little bit more normal yellow into this mix. So what I did on the palette, if you can see it, which I'm sure you can, well, it's been a while, I have warm yellow and transparent yellow, and I'm just kind of mixing those together to create a little bit of a semi-transparent yellow, and that will allow that pink undercoat to shine through and do its work and all that stuff. And of course, I'm starting with yellow because I can be sloppy with it, and it's not going to matter because black is going to coat that yellow very, very easy. So we can kind of be a little less precise at this stage. And that'll be nice because, like I said, the yellow is going to be a couple coats. The black should really only take one coat, and then we'll be good to go. So I'm going to keep the interior of the pants black. We're going to do the exterior, the outer half of the pants yellow, and this will again kind of mimic overall that yellow and gold, or that yellow and black costume from his New Mutant / X-Men days, all that stuff, his non-X-Force look. Were there any design hurdles for Sunspot? I mean, I think the biggest, I don't know if it was a hurdle, but the biggest overall kind of consideration and challenge was getting his flare token economy, I guess, but the special rules around his flare tokens to really gel the way we wanted, to make sure that he was producing enough of them that they weren't hindering his ability to do all the cool things he wanted to, but was compelling enough that it was adding something unique to the character and feeling like the Sunspot we wanted, which was, we really wanted to make sure that the idea that Sunspot has to charge himself up, and especially in his like earlier days, right, he could run out of energy if he pushed himself too hard or anything like that, would have an effect. So we started playing with that, and then it was, you can't always rely on the fact that you're going to have all of those flare tokens. So if you're not going to have all the flare tokens, what's that going to mean for the character? And obviously at the threat value that he was at, that was something that really has to be considered. So you typically wind up with characters like Sunspot or things like that, where you want to make them feel like a average 4 threat, or an average whatever threat they are. And then when a player plays really well or skillfully with their abilities or their economy, their inbuilt economy, whether it's a Mr. Sinister or a Sunspot or whatever, they go from like a mid-range threat to a top end or low end kind of next threat. So if you're a 4, a really skillful player should be able to play with the flare economy and feel like they're having like a pretty low grade 5 threat, so it's a bit of an upgrade. If you don't play super well, you're still feeling like you're getting value out of the character, but it's not as much. And those kind of scaling power levels based on player skill, they're always a little bit tricky to engineer, because if you go too far one direction or the other, you wind up with a character that's just not going to feel as good to play, and they're going to get left on the shelf a lot, because if a player has to work really, really hard to maximize their output in order to get that threat value's worth out of them, they're just going to be like, there are other characters that do it better and easier, right? So those kinds of things, they're always challenging. They take a lot of playtest feedback and iteration and discussions to make sure that everything's kind of clicking the way you want and you're getting those results. But it wasn't really a hurdle in the way in which, like, oh, this was impossible to solve. The biggest hurdle from a visual standpoint was kind of playing with the idea of how we were going to make this character feel mobile and exciting and showcase some of his power sets. We always like to talk about, or do cool special effects on Crisis Protocol characters, especially because they are superheroes, and we get a lot of leeway with how we can express visually them doing their thing in both the art and in miniature form. And that leads to a lot of creativity and a lot of trial and error. So we started with Sunspot in kind of a more traditional flying kind of pose, where he was just zooming off the ground with a bit of a fire burst behind him, and that wasn't really feeling as epic or as interesting as we wanted. So I posed the question or the challenge of, like, what if we did a big flame burst and that was pushing him in the air, so he's like obliterating the ground or a target with his powers, and could that work? And then that just became a question of, how far off the base does he have to go for it to be balanced and steady and all of that good stuff. So it was it was definitely one of those challenges to the engineering team that they knocked out of the park, did very well at in the end, but raised some eyebrows to start, because I was like, oh, how are we going to do that? And those are always the exciting times, when we wind up getting to challenge ourselves or try something new and learn new things, extending yourself and giving yourself that opportunity to kind of fail. And you're like, well, if it doesn't work, we can always go back to the safe pose and that'll be fine. And so that's what we did. But we wound up not having to go back to the safe pose, so it was inconsequential anyway. And that was great. What do I want? I need something a little bit darker. That'll do. Yeah, I think, overall the engineering and sculpting teams and everything, they got a really good mix of that. You can feel the force of the blast, but it still feels like Sunspot isn't being held aloft, but you can tell that there's like pressure going both ways. So he's exerting force down. That force is so powerful, it's kind of pushing back at him. You get a really nice feeling visual interest to the whole thing. And so very happy with where it turned out. But it was definitely one of those, it could have worked, it could have not. Hard to say until you see it done. And those are always the best projects, because usually once you do it once, now all of a sudden you're equipped for the next time, and you can go a bit further and go a little crazier. The evolution of Doctor Strange in the Crisis Protocol line is absolutely one where, just getting him up and elevated on those rings and having them cut through his cloak. Tried to say cloth and cloak at the same time, and it came out as nonsense. But that was one, we started in one spot, and we wound up building off of that in crazy ways to get the cool dimensional portal thing for the second Strange. And those were all iterative processes on each other. That it's just fun to be able to watch skills progress and talent and technical expertise and all that stuff move in ways that then impacts everything, not just, you know, one line, but all the others too. Because, you know, one cool innovation breeds another, and then another, and then another. It's very neat. Chewy was last week. Dallas Kemp hanging out at the office while everyone else was still traveling for Gen Cons, or at least I was, along with a few other folks from the office. We did Gen Con, then we went to our HQ in Roseville and had some good follow-up meetings there and discussed all the cool things that are coming and what's next for the studio. And Dallas got to hang out, and he just got to paint. Probably not next year, though. Next year, I think a Dallas Kemp might be coming with, but we'll see. Now we've returned. All right, so I'm gonna let that yellow dry before we go back and do another coat. Oh, I still have my Squirrel Girl to paint too. I haven't actually painted my Squirrel Girl yet. For shame. I'm just going to make a little black mixture for the cloth because I'm going to skip over and start doing this. So here's where we're going to get a little creative with how the suit goes. Because obviously the design lines aren't identical and there's a lot of different variations of the suit itself. Sometimes they have like a yellow X band that goes across the torso. We might do that. I'm gonna leave that kind of open right now. And we're just gonna go with whatever we feel is right. So we are gonna deviate from how the suit design is because obviously the inset lines and everything are very much tailored to that X-Force costume, but we can paint outside the lines. And so that's what we're going to do here. My biggest thing here is just to be kind of clean with as I black everything out, that I want to be black because I don't want to wind up in a situation where I go over my yellow because then repainting the yellow over black is going to be tough. It's a little bit of care and consideration here. Just taking my time, being consistent. Let's say you can only afford low-end paints like dollar store acrylics. How do you point painting on a super budget? You can absolutely paint with, you know, dollar paints and not fancy artist brushes. In fact, there's a couple of professional painters out there Dallas talks about quite a bit who do just that. It's mostly about, you know, if you're using a thicker acrylic paint or like a cheaper acrylic paint, make sure that you're very aware of how you're thinning out that paint. You know, to ensure that, just thinking here for a second. I mean, we can always erase this later, so let's give it a try. But think about, you know, the consistency of your paints, making sure that they're nice and thinned out, because that's obviously going to make a huge difference to the overall like finished product. The biggest kind of thing when it comes to, you know, your cheaper paints and your higher paints is the pigment size. So the finer the pigment, you know, usually the higher quality the paint is. So those cheaper paints use lower grade pigments, and that just means that they can come out looking chunky or not smooth. So the best way to combat that is just make sure that you're very, very aware of how thinned out your paints are and that they're flowing well. There's a lot of other things that kind of go along to like finishes and brightness and all of that. But you can control most of that through paint applications and everything else. But the big thing that you want is you want to make sure that you have that smoothness. And the way in which you're going to get that smoothness is by having, really good control over the consistency of the paint. And so that's the biggest thing. And then the other part to it, right, is to just make sure that you understand and learn how the paint flows, how it wants to come off the brush. And that's true of the best pigmented paint or like the highest end artist paint in the world to the lowest end. Every paint's going to, behave differently, and much like how a good craftsman learns how to use each tool in their toolbox to the best of their abilities to get the most out of everything, you're going to have to do the same with your paint. So, understanding, okay, this color here has really heavy bodied coverage, therefore I want to make sure that I'm thinning it out and being very careful with how much I'm applying. This paint has really poor coverage, so I have to make sure that I'm being really aware of keeping my base coats really smooth and thin, because I'm going to have to do a number of different applications of it. You'll find that you'll have colors that work really well for you, colors that don't. Maybe you'll find out that there's a color in the line that works better if you mix it with two of the better colors that you like. It's just experimentation, but there's nothing. My very first miniatures that I ever painted were definitely done with dollar store craft paint, because I didn't have a huge repository of paint. All of my, my limited dollars when I was a teenager were going towards miniatures and stuff. And those turned out really, really great. I was very happy with them at the time, and I still have several of them. And I'm like, oh yeah, you can definitely tell there's a difference in everything, in technique and approach and colors and all that. But I still really like the way they turned out. So they just have a very different feel. And it's reflective of, where I was as a hobbyist and a painter at the time. But don't let anyone tell you, I always, like, if I went out and bought a Formula One race car, it's not going to make me drive necessarily any faster. The car is capable of going much faster, but my ability to get that speed and control out of the car doesn't exist. I'm not trained that way. I don't know how the car drives. I don't know, the first thing about how to control such a vehicle. Like, you have to learn the tool just as much as you have to have the tool to help you. And so in the end, right, you can kind of apply that to everything. You can go out and buy the most expensive, best paints and brushes and everything else in the world. You can buy the fanciest airbrushes and all that stuff. At the end of the day, if you haven't gone through the training of how to use it, if you haven't gained the skills and the technique to be able to control those things, it doesn't make a difference. The paint doesn't apply itself. You apply the paint. And so, maybe at some point when you're able to add a couple of higher end items to your toolbox and your hobby supplies, you might be like, oh yeah, achieving X, Y, or Z is so much easier or quicker because I have these better quality things to use. It's your ability to use them that makes them better. It's not just them themselves, right? Take that from somebody who's tossed a lot of money that I probably shouldn't have at things that, were supposedly higher quality and therefore way better for what I was trying to do. And then it turned out that it didn't really matter because I didn't know how to use them. So higher quality or not, the results were the same. I looked at it and said, I need to practice this. The first time I got an airbrush, everyone had sold me on the idea that the airbrush was just going to make everything effortless and smooth, and there was nothing that you really had to learn. It was point and shoot, and it just spat out beauty. And so, yeah, I went all in and got the airbrush, got the compressor, got everything like, not top of the line, but definitely higher than an amateur probably should for learning. And sat down to use it and went, oh yeah, this isn't point and click at all. There's So many things that I should have learned first and absolutely didn't. And so, yeah, I got to learn those things on a nicer machine and a nicer brush. But like ultimately, the technique and the lessons, you know, they made no difference, really. I could have gotten probably better results overall from something that was a little cheaper and allowed me to build up to understanding how it worked than just jumping wholesale in and being like, let's do this. So end of the day, right? Never let your tools might impede you a little bit, but at the end, you know, skill and technique are going to make up 85% of the final product, and your ability to be able to work with and maximize what you have is going to have a much greater impact on your overall quality and final form than any amount of like high class, high quality material or tool. And again, Dallas knows the names of the painters, but there are a couple folks out there that turn in, you know, award-winning competition pieces, and they're using dollar store synthetic brushes and all of that stuff, right? They understand how those materials work. They've maximized their technique around them, and that's what they prefer to use. And so you hand them something like a Kolinsky brush, and they're like, whoa, what is this? I don't like this. This doesn't behave the same way. This doesn't perform the same way. I don't like this. Whoops. Exactly what I said not to do. Just get some black on that yellow, but we can kind of clean it up. Do my best to avoid the little face mask so we can get that in the yellow. Maybe we'll just leave it pink. Who knows? See how spicy we get. All right. So that takes care of that. Mix in a little bit of highlight. So we use some turquoise to highlight our black. So I'm going to leave the skin because Roberto's overall look is often very, very dark. Usually he's just pure black, and then he's got maybe a couple little orange embers, or, you know, artists who paint in color in 2 dimensions can give him a little glowy orange aura. We as miniatures painters can't really do that and have it look correct from all the different angles that you can see something in 3 dimensions, so we're not going to do that here. It's possible, but it's not. I'm not. We're not going to invest that kind of effort into a tabletop piece. So we're just going to work around that a little bit differently. Yeah, same concept as the chat's talking about, you know, photographers with cameras and everything, right? I mean, did the same thing. Decided I wanted to be able to shoot really nice photos of miniatures and scenics and all that. And so I got a fancy camera, took a few shots, and was like, oh, this doesn't work like that. You got to actually learn how the aperture goes, and, you know, all these other different knickknacks and bobs and things on the camera. You can tell that I really applied myself to it because I don't even remember at this point what all those things were. But there was a whole bunch of training that went into being able to utilize, you know, the equipment and what that higher quality camera could offer that I just didn't know. And so much of it, again, is technique and skill. It's not about material as much. And a lot of, a lot of sales are made off the idea that they're going to make your life easier, right? Oh, this new technology is going to do this, or this upgraded fancy new version of X, Y, or Z is going to provide you this. And sometimes they'll be a little bit of a time saver, but ultimately the thing that's going to help you the most is practice. It's going to be you learning how to do the thing you want to do and understanding how it functions and works and all of that stuff. We're just kind of defining the black here with a little bit of highlight, being a bit sloppy with it, but we'll go over this with a little bit of a wash, and that should tone it back down a little. Bring it back in, but my goal here, right, is to really make this black different from this black, and I'm doing that by leaving this black as mostly just pure black. So this is just the satin black from Monument, and then this one is a mix of satin black, coal black, dark or black blue, and then turquoise. And so by adding that kind of chromatic color to it, it becomes a really different visual feel and looks like a different material to what the skin tone is. And so despite the fact that we have a lot of black going on here, we wind up with visual distinction, and the eye is able to separate the two areas, and they feel like very different materials and textures and everything else. So that's kind of whenever you're working with browns or blacks or anything of the same color, you can always get in there, and by using some different mix-ins, kind of like a certain ice cream creamery, you can come up with very different flavors.
So when you reached in there and like smudged with your finger, what were you doing?
I don't know. I was probably correcting a mistake, but I don't remember smudging with my fingers.
Oh, okay.
So I was very clearly just doing it by habit.
Yeah, because sometimes I reach in and I like almost like tap in a gradient, almost like I do with makeup.
Yeah, you can do that. You can absolutely paint with your fingers.
Yeah, it's not, I don't recommend it, but on certain spots, right, where it's very open.
But especially when when you make a mistake or whatever, you get a little bit of color that sploops from one side to the other, and you didn't want that. Using your thumb or your finger to wipe away that color absolutely works. They always tell you, don't touch your miniature, don't touch your miniature. And that's great advice, but it doesn't always apply. Like sometimes touching the miniature to wipe away paint or to kind of blend something in, similar to how you would blend in foundation or makeup, like it's okay. It's okay. Just make sure your thumb, like whatever finger's touching it, is clean, right? And as long as it's clean, then you should be good to go. But definitely sometimes my brain just goes on autopilot and I just do things that mechanically I normally do all the time, because again, it comes back to that consistent training, that consistency, and just doing the thing, and eventually you just kind of develop your stuff. For example, brush licking. Cleaning the brush and then reformatting the tip of the bristles by doing a quick mouth lick. That's just, it's just muscle memory at this point. I can't do it any other way. We could spend a lot of time kind of refining this yellow and smoothing it out. We probably will spend a little bit more time, but I don't want to get lost in just this. So now what I'm going to do is take some flesh wash. And we're just going to go in. I'm actually going to let that dry just for a second. I'm not entirely sold on our yellow being completely ready for a wash, so we're not going to do it. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with our hand-drawn lines here for the X on the suit, which is, again, not part of the sculpt, but I think we have knocked in fairly okay. So I'm going to keep those. It'll work. Maybe if I was to go back, you know, I'd think about cutting off this V right here. Maybe. Or like artificially closing it in. I don't know, we can be brave. Let's give it a try. Let's just see if we can sketch in a little bit of a better look on this back. So I'm just going to kind of like narrow in the V a bit. Something kind of like that. That kind of sells the idea we're going for a little bit better. Just come in, kind of redo our highlights here. That. Let me just come in, do a little bit. Work right there. Come back in. Just think about how we want to define that cloth, and that'll make that. And that'll make that inset line that's there for the X-Force suit not as prevalent. We just need to clean that up. There. Something like that. We could refine that until we were happy with those lines. There. So that buys it in a little bit better. Technically, we could do the same thing over here and just erase this little bit of the V in the abs and go right under the chesticles. That is a true anatomy word right there. And then that'll kind of pull in our lines a bit better. Here, clean up that a little bit, and of course this is going to be a imperfect job just based on where it's placed, but kind of get those to match a little better. Clean that up, make it look like it's part of the overall suit design, like so. There. I think that removing those little bits there makes our little X work a bit better. So now we've got that classic, more classic X and gold thing. Let's put the little, we'll do the, I think the X normally on these is black, but I'm going to do it red just so it pops out. is just fill it in with red. And then we will do a quick overshot of black. So we'll have the red on the interior of the X, the black X on the exterior, and that should pretty good. So the fire from his suit we're going to do, so if you've noticed I've stuck really close to like primary bright zippy yellows, right? The fire we're going to do more orangey. So just like we did with the blacks where we have all these differences in our chromatic colors and our mixes, we're going to try to do the same with the fire to differentiate it and make it look and feel correct, but also visually distinct from the yellow of the suit. And so, because we're almost out of time and I don't have enough time to like mess with the yellows the whole time, we'll grab our orange, we'll grab our yellow. And so you can see here how this yellow feels very different from this yellow, right? Because we've got primary yellow, but now we've got orange in our yellow. And we can play with that all the way through. But if this is kind of going to be our central color, and the orange will be our darker color, so we come up here, we can like kind of mix that in, you know. And then we want this color to be kind of on the bright end. So that's kind of our fire progression, right? And we can take just a titch of black and we can kind of work that up. And so there's our flame without some white. We might put some white in at the bottom here, but this is going to be our goal, right? And so if most of our color lies in here, it's really going to be different from this. And so that's kind of like the goal.
I do feel like it's really great if you don't have a wet palette and you're thinking about reasons why they can be fun to use. One of them is certainly because of things like that, being able to kind of plot out.
Yeah, it's really nice to be able to do your progressions and see how it kind of works out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely a strength of the wet palette. Then you can save these for later and you can come back and try to color match and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But a useful little visualization tool of how you want to build up these colors and all of that.
I feel like especially for flame, I spent a lot of time in my early hobby days not happy with the gradient I was creating, right? Or feeling like it was too dark or it was too light. And I feel like had I been using a wet palette earlier, I might have not had some of those struggles.
Well, flames are also tricky too. We talk about this a little bit from time to time, right? But the concept that a flame is brightest at its center and darkest at its edges, it's not usually how we think, or at least it's not how I naturally think of fire.
Right.
You know, you always think of like, oh, fire is bright, and it's bright on the tips, so the tip is yellow, but the tip of flame is typically like orange to black. You know, it's very dark. And playing with that contrast and then, you know, the vibrancy on the inside versus the outside.
And it also goes against how we generally think of light and shadow on a miniature. So switching it, you know, to put the light towards the center or towards wherever you feel like the hottest is, and then building to dark is kind of the opposite of what we normally do when we're painting a miniature, or even if you're doing something simple like dry brushing. You know, dry brushing a lighter color on top of a darker color is not how flame do.
But a fantastic way to get good looking flames is to dry brush actually, or stipple.
Right.
So starting like I'm doing here, right, where I'm just kind of like laying in my yellows really rough. And I'm going to let a bit of that pink serve as, now normally probably you'd want to start with a white, you know, as the undertone, because you use the pink to shade, but as we just discussed, you know, flame is brightest at its core. So you don't really want the shadow to be on the inside. A couple different ways you could approach that if you wanted to use the pink as an overall theme. I just kind of did it because it was quick to base the miniature that way. But, you know, like you'd probably want to go through, paint all this white so that you'd get your brightest centers. And then you would go through and start building out your colors dry brushing, stippling, a lot of different ways to do it with your darks and going up. But we're just gonna have fun for these last 20 minutes. This is one of those things where you'd probably spend an hour or more just futzing around with it, because you can do a lot of really fun stuff when it comes to doing these effects, like wet blending, which is kind of gonna be my goal here, if I can work fast enough, is to do some wet blending to mix my colors and get everything kind of going. But dry brushing, stippling, there's a lot of different ways to approach this. And let's just go ahead and start. So I'm going to grab this orange, because again, I'm going to play in this range right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that orange and I'm going to start blending it in on the edges. I just need to make sure I've got enough paint so I don't pull anything up. And as I work that paint, heavier in some areas than others, those two colors will just kind of mix, and hopefully we'll create a nice little looking flame gradient. And this is another reason why doing this over a white would be better, because you know, one of the things that's going to happen is as you wet blend these paints, you're going to pull stuff up. We're going to see that pink undertone happen or show through, and so if that was a white undertone instead, obviously we'd have to do less work to make sure that everything was functioning properly. But that's not our life, and that's okay. So one of the fun things about doing the wet blend is the fact that you kind of just let the paint do what it wants and be pretty, you know, loosey-goosey with it. Because our goal here is to create something that's kind of a natural blend and shade and shadow and all this, and then we can go back through and later on, once it's dry, we can refine it with like transparencies and glazes and all that good stuff. We can go back in and highlight with extra stuff. But overall, hopefully, what we're getting right now is you're seeing that, hey, we've got yellows here, but the yellows are different. We have more orange right now than yellow, but we can go back through and fix that up as well as we go through kind of our wet blending process. But I want to work kind of fast, so I'm being, you know, sketchy and loose with it, because the longer I take, the drier that paint gets, the harder it's going to be to wet blend everything, and I've got more colors to go. But if I want to, I can always go back to my yellow and say, oh, well, I want to add a little bit more yellow down here, right? So you can absolutely work the two colors kind of back and forth and back. And then you go in and you dive into your next color. So we're going to go here, kind of in this zone. I'm just going to kind of work that in. And again, now we just want to be a little closer towards the edges or the exterior of the flame. We want a little bit of an overbrush kind of idea, right? Just use all of this great detail that the engineers gave us in the flames to kind of guide where we're going to color out these.
For the uninitiated, what does overbrushing mean?
So overbrushing is dry brushing. The difference being that with dry brushing, you're using a dry brush, right? So the dry brush means that you've wiped off the vast majority of paint from the brush and there's very, very little paint left. Overbrushing, you have more paint on the brush, so the goal here is that it's the same idea where you're using a really light stroke or a light touch over the surface so that it's only hitting those raised edges, but because there's more paint on the brush, the effect is more dramatic. So it's a quicker build. So like, for example, the reason I say I'm overbrushing here is my goal, right, is to just run the brush kind of gently or lightly over the tip or the top of the surface. And then because I'm not pushing hard, the brush is only catching those raised areas. And by doing that, you know, I'm getting this natural effect where the deeper or lower areas are staying uncolored or the same, and the higher areas, which I want, are catching all the paint. So it's kind of a fast cheat. If you've ever heard people talk about, you know, edge highlighting, right? Doing edge highlights, use the flat of the brush and then just run it over the edge. That's an overbrush, effectively, because what you're doing is you're relying on the three-dimensionality of the surface to catch the paint and the brush in a way that you want, which then naturally leads to your highlight effect, or that kind of thing. In this case, we're shading instead of highlighting, but we're using the concept as if we were doing a highlight, because we want it on the tips or the tops. And then we can take a little bit of this, and if we want to get really spicy, we can create a darker color. And then this can come in. We can kind of work this over the tips. And so this really comes back to like, what's the effect you want? Do you want it to feel like it's lava and it's cool and that contrast? And then the real goal is to go back in, as you do this, and you might have to reclaim some of your brighter internal highlights and stuff. This is where stippling also can come into real good handy, because if you stipple, some of that stuff will show at the bottom. But again, we're just looking at like the edges where the flame is the coolest. We're going to cool it down by using this darker color. And so this is going to mimic the idea of heat or light from heat, right? And the longer you take on this process and work it, the more believable and cool it's going to look. But this is your basic fundamental here. And again, it's all about deciding like, where's your hottest source? Where's your coldest source? How do those interplay with each other? Where are things like broiling? Where are things cooling? All of that stuff. And if you really want to push a hot spot, the trick is to just use contrast like everything else. So for example, if I really want this eye to look really, really hot, I can go in and I can just add more cold around it, and then that contrast is going to push that heat up, so it's just going to look brighter because of the contrast around it. And you can play with that stuff too, right? And so all of this becomes kind of tricks and tools to sell the effect that you want. You can go back in, you watch like a Sarastro video or anything, he's done a lot of really cool ember effects on some of his paint jobs, where you just kind of like go back in and you dot in some really black dots, or because you think about how lava looks, right? Lava is really, really bright, but then it's got these cooled black, half-melted stone effects on the top, because the lava is constantly bubbling. So the heat goes up, it cools, it falls back down, it becomes hot, and then that cycle continuously repeats. So that's a thing that you can play with too, and your eye's going to read that in a very different way than in other ways. And so, again, it just kind of comes back to like knowing overall what the effect is that you want to sell, how do you want to achieve it. It's like now I can come back in and I can maybe add a little bit more yellow, or we lost it. I can erase that because I didn't like that. That wasn't for me. But doing this with like a glaze or a controlled wash is a great way to do it. You can warm up your temperatures, get back in and build everything up. But overall, that's the general idea in about 10 minutes of how you want to build and sell these effects. So again, going back in and playing with that contrast, just saying, all right, let's add a little bit more yellow here. Let's add some here. Let's go in and just add some white from the hand, because that's where our hottest spot is maybe. And so grab some of our titanium white, mix that in to give it just a little tinge, and then pull that out. I want to be pretty subtle with this, but kind of plane that out. Maybe we want to go a little further with that. We can do a little bit of, you know, and like maybe we want to get some heat down here. Maybe we want a little heat eye here. We want some over here because we think it's hot here. It's internal here, so we'll make it hot there. Maybe there's a little hot spot here. Now you just start adding in your little kisses of heat, or like where you want everything to kind of be. If you just want a little hot zone or whatever, you can do all of that. It just comes back to playing with those contrasts. And then again, you can kind of meld everything together with a little bit of a transparency or a wash layer, a glaze layer. Glazing yellow over all of this makes it look oh so good. So I definitely recommend looking at something like that. Maybe we went a little too far here, so we're just gonna like pull that back in. You know, you can paint on and you can always come back through and say, okay, well, I want to make this area just a little bit more mellow or more heat or whatever. That's all available for you to do. And it just comes down to playing with it until you're happy with it. And there's, again, no end of techniques that you can utilize. Just kind of make it work for you. The last thing I want to do before we quit here, due to time and meetings and all that other good stuff, is see, and this is the process that I really like, is just futzing with this stuff. Maybe we want that underside to be really hot because that's where all the melting stuff is. So we make that really hot. Take a little bit of this and we can just come in and do a little transparent yellow over this to kind of like blend it all together. So you can see as you put that transparency over, how it just kind of like meters everything together and blends everything out, gives it that extra pop of color. And so don't skip that part. It can be really important. Like it can be the thing that takes your, what looks like a glorious colored mess and turns it into an effect that feels like fire. But now we have very different, we have very different feel from here to here. And the last thing I think we're going to do is we're just going to go back to that yellow. And I just want to kind of tone it down. So I'm going to use a flesh wash here. Because again, contrast super important. So we're just going to do a quick wash. Really define those colors. Get those crevices and everything feeling good. And then after this wash, you can go back through and do another highlight layer, which I would definitely recommend. You can leave it, which makes it pretty good for tabletop because we've got all these different shades going on anyway. You can two brush blend this and control it and wick it back away. We forgot to do his mask. No! Maybe we'll come back in and do that really quick. But regardless, again, you always want to be thinking about, and we didn't do the flame on his hand, but that's okay. It's the same idea as what we did down below. But you always want to be thinking about contrast. Contrast is the most important, bit to making good miniatures, good art in general is, giving the eye something to differentiate from, accentuating those spots on the miniatures, the highlights, the lowlights, all of that. And sometimes contrast can be as easy as just a dark line, separating areas out with a dark line. Even if those areas have no different colors, think about your favorite Saturday morning cartoons or animated shows or anything like that. There's not a lot of actual shading or color difference that goes on there. It's all really based on the fact that there is a really good clean separation between color layers in that dark lining. Sometimes there's a little gradient of color depending on the quality of the animation or the style of the animation. But for the most part, it's clean blocks of color separated by clean lines. And if you follow that overall advice with your painting of miniatures, you can do a lot with very little. You can get away with so much looking so good with almost minimal effort applied, because the eye will do a lot of the work for you. All right, I just want to go in and kind of knock out this X. There we go. And then, just for funsies, a couple little swooshy embers. Because why not? Because why not? I'm just going to want to come in and time. Create a little bit of a glaze. Run that over. Pull that off. Just to give them a little bit of that, like, sunspotty heat feeling. That we can't really do a overglow, but we can mess around with some glazes and transparencies and stuff and give a little bit more character to that black skin. That sunspot skin, where it's just pure dark. And then maybe if we went too far, we just come back in with our little black, and again, we go back to our contrast idea, so we can fix whatever we don't like. Kind of like running in the colors this way. All right. Shablam! 2 minutes to go. All right, so overall, we missed this little piece of flame, but we did pretty good. We got everything kind of based out and ready to go. Got our cool new, not X-Force red and blue suit going on here. So now, if you don't like the red and blue X-Force suit, you have an idea on how you might approach doing the more classic or iconic, potentially, yellow and black suit. There you go. Differentiate your blacks from your black sunspot face to your black blue. We used a turquoise for our X-Men suit, which is pretty classic for the suit colors because it's supposed to be some kind of like pleather or whatever. It's all there. Thank you so much for joining me on this return to form. Hope you had fun. Hope you learned something. Hope you're excited to come back tomorrow. If you're curious about how to paint a miniature with a lot of hair, like how do I do it? How do I make a hairy man beast for a miniature? Be sure to tune in tomorrow. Dallas Kemp's going to walk you through all of that on the fabulous Weapon X miniature. He's going to show you how to make him a beastly hairy man from bare skin to all the hair like a bear. Till next time, I'll see you on next Tuesday. Have a good day. Goodbye, and thank you.